before we do that, can you just quickly sort of paint the Abronia genus just as sort of as a summary? Because I think some people may not be familiar with them as much, but it's quite a diverse species as far as I'm like, looking at your content or looking at your posts and whatnot. And so I know you've already mentioned the Mexico and the Guatemala, but maybe you could just kind of run through just the overtop view of what that genus looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah. So up until recently, there was, depending on who you ask, between 27 and 29 species of Abronia. And these are the arboreal alligator lizards is their common name. There's usually a lot of different names associated with that. Usually it comes off of their Latin name. So like Abronia martin del campi is the Martin del Campo's arboreal alligator lizard. So kind of nice that the common name and Latin name tie in nicely together. But most of these species are found in montane cloud forest habitat. Been building too many of them, starting to lose focus of where I'm at. But they're that kind of high altitude cloud forest. If you picture a bunch of huge oak trees that have tillandsias, bromeliads, Spanish moss, sheet moss, or club moss growing all over it, that kind of really beautiful epiphytic look, that's like prime Abronia habitat. Most of it is old oak growth forest, which is really tough because obviously we know old oak does not grow very fast. So when those habitats are deforested, it takes, centuries for them to really come back from that clear cutting in the first place. But the species seem to be pretty similar as far as size. There are some smaller species and some larger species. And they are kind of notated by two different kind of morphologies. You have ones with the really well-known subocular horns or scales. So they kind of have those spikes on the ears. Really makes them look like the true dragons that people call them. And then you have the species lacking those. So those are some of the more common species in the trade, like Abronia graminea, and then Abronia tanniata. A lot of those are lacking those subocular horns, and usually are a little bit smaller. You're talking maybe between 6 to 8 inches for most species, up to some of the largest species. One I think was noted to be over 14 inches, which I believe was an Abronia fimbriata. So some are very long. They are very tail heavy. So you've got about similar size between body structure and then tail length, as they use their tails basically prehensile to kind of grip onto trees and branches. So a lot of times you'll actually see them hanging from a branch or from a plant from that tail, and just like, what are you doing? But they are not venomous, popular to local belief. They do pack quite a strong bite.
Really?
Yeah, for little lizards, they are extremely strong with their bite force. They will just latch onto you, and they literally, like an alligator or a crocodile, will death roll. And when they clamp down, it's like a vice grip. I mean, I've been bit by a couple, and they first bite you and you're like, oh, okay, that doesn't feel good, and then you try and kind of like remove them or move them in a certain way, and then they just clamp down harder and then harder, to the point where, I mean, I don't consider myself easily put in pain, but they put a hurting on me a couple times. And like some are super chill, and I think that comes with just how much you work with them. So some people pull theirs out every day. Off with my collection, you kind of have as natural of a life as they can, and it just sometimes stresses them out. And honestly, I have a large enough collection where pulling is feasible, but they do pack quite a quite a big bite, and they'll do that death roll. Another factor about them that's interesting is they can actually drop their tails and regrow them. But what I've been noticing is, and this is sometimes one of those characteristics that you can kind of tell a wild caught versus a captive bred animal. Some people say that Abronia drop their tails pretty easily. In my personal experience, I've never had an animal drop a tail. And I kid you not, they've jumped off of things. I've grabbed them by their tail, and they just literally swing there and don't drop their tails at all. So they're not super fragile, and we get a lot of questions about that from people beginning. They're kind of afraid to restrain their animal in fear that the tail is going to break off. But I think most of that comes from either cage mate aggression. So if you're having a litter of multiple animals together, sometimes tail nips happen, but they can actually regrow the tail to some extent. You can usually tell pretty easily regenerated tail versus fully natural tail. But that is one of the things that in the wild, they're probably often grabbed by birds or mammals or other lizards, and they will detach that tail and then regrow it. So,
well, and even the color is such a wide diversity of color. It's kind of crazy in that way.
Yeah, one of my favorite species, just an absolute beautiful species, is the Abronia smithi, or if Cody would correct me and say it's smithy. Gotta love Latin, one eye, two eyes is an I or E. But they come in like 3 to 4 different phenotypic colorations. So you get kind of a really nice emeraldish green, sometimes even a little lighter. I've got a female that's just beautiful. She's like almost like a limeish green. And then there's also the kind of blue type. So they're not full blue like you'd see Graminia, but it kind of is that blue wash to emerald green. And then there's the black phenotype, which has orange like fleshing, and then like kind of some of the scales in between are like a little highlighter orange. Those are just incredible. And when you see all 3 of those together, we're still trying to figure out, is it a locality thing? Is it a line bred trait? Or what I actually think it may be, and I've yet to find data to fully support or fully extinguish this theory, but I think that the blue phenotype is actually indicative to males only. All the males that I've seen, or all the blue animals I've seen, have been males, and then all of the black and orange have been females. So I wonder if there's actual sexual dimorphism happening there. The green seems to be both in males and females. And that's one of the really cool things is there's not a ton of people working with that species, but if we can continue to try and breed them, a litter that's grown up will definitely prove some of those results, or at least I would hope.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the other weird thing about them is, besides the sort of prehensile tail, they don't look that arboreal. Like if you didn't know anything about them, you might look at them and go, well, they kind of have shorter legs. They sort of look like a terrestrial species that might burrow, yet they're in the trees. So if you were to see them in the wild, they would almost look out of place up there in the trees.
Well, and so that's where I think it's funny. We think of a lot of the arboreal stuff as sitting on these little tiny twigs, much like a chameleon would, sitting in a bunch of leaflets. But these guys, I think, are almost like a ground-dwelling species. They're actually was just a big group of, or another genus that was added to Abronia, which are much more terrestrial. And I think they probably evolved from the same common ancestor, but some went to the ground and some went to the trees. But with these trees, you're talking about huge, massive oak trees with these huge branches, and they're almost in a terrestrial situation, just up in the air. They're mostly hanging out under the moss and in tillandsias and bromeliads. They really have kind of built this whole little ecosystem up in a single tree sometimes. And that's where you do see some of those almost terrestrial characteristics versus the arboreal ones. But they pretty much are almost exclusively arboreal, at least to my knowledge. You occasionally will find them down on the ground, but most interactions that people have with them on the ground are either in tillandsias that have fallen. Looks like a couple of lights are going to go out. But the other option is if they've fallen out of a tree. That's another thing about Abronia is they're actually extremely hardy in the fact that they'll fall a tree and just hit the ground running. And they seem to suffer very little damage when that happens.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. So really, it's almost like a terrestrial lifestyle just because the trees are so massive that they don't really need those typical, almost like nimble characteristics or finesse for climbing trees. They just get to exist up there in these big giant oak trees. So let's go back to you and Forrest. So you're just starting this idea, and as you're talking about it, you're saying we're going to change the world with this. What were you guys talking about? Like what